Imagine this. The year is 67 AD. The heat of the Roman summer clings to the marble stones of the Forum, where the emperor strolls with his new bride. The people watch, but not in celebration, not with joy. Their eyes follow the imperial couple, in stunned, horrified silence. At the emperor's side walks a young woman no more than 15 or 16, draped in silks, her hair coiled like a goddess's, her figure graceful and ethereal. She says nothing. She smiles not. She walks with the fragility of someone not born into this role, but forced into it. And yet no one dares speak aloud the name that clings to the back of their tongues. Sporus, because that woman, beside Nero, Rome's maddened god emperor, was not born a woman at all. What happened to Sporus is not merely a story of a broken boy. It is a mirror held up to the face of unchecked power, a story of love rotted into madness, of identity turned to performance, of humanity strangled by the hands of obsession. And if you dare to walk further down this corridor of history, beware. It is no simple tale of Roman excess. It is a psychological autopsy, an imperial autopsy, a human autopsy. Let us begin. Nero did not enter history as a monster. When he ascended the throne at the age of 16, many whispered that the gods had sent him. He was young, artistic, intelligent, and crucially not yet corrupted by the bureaucratic bloodsport of the Senate. In his early years, Nero reduced taxes, opened the imperial coffers for lavish public games, and even took to the stage himself, charming the commoners with song and verse. Some saw in him a new Apollo. But Rome is no place for innocence. By the time he reached his late 20s, Nero had become a creature Rome had never seen before. A man who could rewrite reality with his voice alone, who could kill with a nod, exile with a sigh, and unmake a life in the time it takes to draw breath. The once golden boy became a man who trusted no one, feared everyone, and ruled as if fear itself were his only advisor. He had once known love, or at least something like it. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea was not born a queen, but she might as well have been. She was beautiful, yes, but that was merely the gateway. Her real power was her mind. In a world where women were expected to bear children, not ambition, she possessed the instincts of a tactician. Where others flattered Nero, Poppaea challenged him. Where others bowed, she maneuvered. She entered Nero's life as an affair, one of many. At the time, he was still married to Octavia, a noblewoman of cold temperament and political convenience. But Poppaea was no passing indulgence. She was a fire to Octavia's ice, and Nero became a moth. He divorced Octavia. The people rioted. He married Poppaea. The Senate murmured. He lavished her with treasures from the ends of the earth. Silks from the east, perfume from Arabia, sapphires from the Nile. And when Poppaea spoke, Nero listened. That was her brilliance. That was her mistake. The accounts of Poppaea's death are murky, twisted through the biased ink of Roman historians. But one fact is constant. It was Nero who killed her. She was pregnant with what might have been their second child. Some say they argued over chariot races. Others claim she mocked his singing. Whatever the cause, the result was horror. Nero, drunk with wine, mad with stress, struck her. Whether with a kick or with fists, no one agrees. But he struck her, hard enough to cause internal bleeding. The Empress of Rome, the woman who once held his soul in her hands, died slowly on the marble floor of the palace, her unborn child dying with her. It was not a political murder. It was not even cold-blooded. It was worse than both. It was the death of love corrupted. When Nero realized what he had done, the man who ruled 60 million souls collapsed like a child. He cradled her body. He screamed at the gods. He offered bribes and threats to every physician in Rome, but nothing could raise the dead. Something inside him shattered forever. Nero refused to cremate Poppaea. He embalmed her like an Egyptian queen, laid her in a golden tomb, and ordered the court to treat her as if she were still alive. Her favorite seat was left empty at feasts. Her name was spoken in present tense. Woe to the senator who forgot and referred to her as dead. It was during this descent into madness that Nero first noticed a boy, just a boy, who walked the palace. Halls with quiet grace and devastating resemblance. His name was Sporus. This was perhaps 14, maybe 15. A freed slave, educated within the imperial household, trained for administrative duties, an elite position in some ways, but one dependent on the whim of imperial favor. And his face? That was the curse. Roman chroniclers agree on this. Sporus looked uncannily like the dead Empress. The curve of his cheekbones, the wide, melancholic eyes, the fragile mouth. In a Rome obsessed with omens and shadows, Nero saw Sporus not as a coincidence, but a sign. He had murdered his goddess. Now the gods had sent her back. Sporus never had a choice. Nero didn't ask. He ordered. Surgeons were summoned. The best in Rome, though that meant little. Ancient medicine was crude, brutal, and terrifying. There would be no anesthesia, no antiseptic, only knives, red-hot irons, and screams. Sporus was castrated. A procedure was justified as an imperial transformation, but it was mutilation, plain and savage. Sporus was stripped not only of his body's future, but of his agency, his manhood, his self. From that moment on, he would not be a boy. He would not be a man. He would not be anything at all but what Nero demanded, a living echo, a doll dressed in the skin of the dead. Then came the wedding, not a metaphor, not a euphemism, a full imperial marriage ceremony. Nero gave Sporus a new name, Sabina Poppaea's name. The court seamstresses crafted gowns to flatter his altered figure. Jewels once worn by Poppaea were pressed into his hair. Tutors drilled him in the gestures of noblewomen, how to walk, how to tilt his head, how to laugh softly and flutter his eyes. He learned to speak in a higher register. He learned to eat delicately. He learned to answer to darling, wife, my goddess. And then, under the oil lamps of 1,000 guests, Nero married his doll. To those who didn't know the truth, it may have looked like a grand affair. To those who did, it was horror masquerading as celebration. From the moment the vows were spoken, Sporus became the Empress of Rome, not in law, not in lineage, but in spectacle. He was given his own wing in the palace. Servants addressed him as Augusta. His wardrobe was filled with dresses that once belonged to Poppaea. His presence was expected at all state functions. He sat beside Nero at feasts, paraded through the streets in a litter adorned with flowers, and received foreign diplomats who bowed and called him Domina. But the luxury was a coffin lined with velvet. Every morning, Sporus awoke in a room that was not his. Every mirror reminded him of the body that was no longer his. Every interaction required performance. He could not grieve, because grief would betray the illusion. He could not speak truth, because truth would offend the emperor. Even his silence was scripted. The palace was full of actors, of course senators pretending loyalty, generals pretending love for the arts. But Sporus's role was not political. It was personal. Nero didn't need a symbol. He needed a resurrection. And so Sporus performed the dead. Nero did not simply indulge a fantasy. He lived in it. He would speak to Sporus as if he truly were Poppaea. He would recount memories of their past memories that were never Sporus's. He would grow angry if Sporus didn't respond with the right emotion, or remember things that had never happened to him. No, Sabina, Nero would whisper. Do you remember our garden in Baia? The oleanders? The song the birds sang that morning? And Sporus would nod. Yes, my lord, I remember. Every lie was survival. It was not enough to act. Like Poppaea, Sporus had to become her possessor grace, her voice, her dreams, her ghost. And if he slipped, if he hesitated, laughed too deeply, walked too quickly, it could cost him his life. Because Nero didn't just want a woman. He wanted the same woman, and Sporus had become the vessel for a phantom. In 67 A.D., Nero, convinced of his divine talent, set off for Greece. He fancied himself the reincarnation of Orpheus and Apollo, and intended to tour the sacred festivals, competing in music and poetry contests where no one dared let him lose. Sporus, naturally, went with him. Imagine it, the Emperor of Rome arrives in Corinth with his court in tow, and beside him is a teenage boy dressed as an empress, wearing the sapphires of a murdered woman. Greek nobles stared in mute horror. But they played along. They called Sporus Sabina Augusta. They offered her gifts. They invited her to banquets and smiled politely when she offered rehearsed compliments. In Athens, Nero performed a 10-hour lyre recital. Sporus sat beside him, veiled, applauding at the proper moments. Every gesture was monitored. Every eye was watching. The illusion had to be perfect, but madness, like all things Roman, could not last forever. By 68 A.D., the empire was beginning to crack under the weight of Nero's ego. His endless tours, his musical obsessions, his neglect of military affairs, it was too much. The Senate turned on him. The Praetorian Guard declared for a new emperor. The provinces rebelled. Rome, that patient old mistress, was done with her spoiled child. Nero fled the capital with only a handful of loyalists and Sporus. Even as the empire collapsed, the fantasy did not. Nero still addressed him as wife. He still spoke of plans for them to live in peace together, to start over. To the last moment, he clung to the illusion. In a villa outside Rome. As enemy soldiers closed in, Nero prepared for death. He could not bear to be captured, stripped of his divine image, mocked by the same Senate that once bowed, and so he took his own life. According to some, as the blade approached his throat, he whispered, "What an artist dies in me." And with him died the performance, but not for Sporus. Nero's death should have been Sporus's freedom, it wasn't. Now untethered, he became a living relic of the emperor's madness, an artifact, a curiosity, and a potential threat. For whoever claimed power next, Sporus was both asset and liability. He was passed from man to man like an heirloom soaked in blood. First the general Nymphidius Sabinus, then the mad emperor Otho, then Vitellius. Each treated him the same. Each called him Sabina. Each forced him to wear the dresses, to play the role, to smile. Vitellius, perhaps the cruelest of all, had something special planned. He announced that Sporus would be paraded in the Colosseum, where he would be forced to reenact the rape of Proserpina before thousands of jeering spectators. It would be the final act of humiliation, a public undoing of whatever scraps of dignity remained. Sporus did not wait for the curtain to rise. He found poison. And he drank it. He was likely no more than 20 when he died. We don't know what he liked to eat. We don't know if he ever loved someone. We don't know what he dreamed of before his body was taken from him, before his name was overwritten, before his voice was reshaped into a lie. All we know is this: he was a boy, then he was an empress, then he was a ghost, and then finally, defiantly, he was gone. Story is not just a footnote in the annals of Roman depravity. It is a warning one that echoes across millennia. It reminds us what happens when one man is allowed to possess another, so completely that even their identity becomes imperial property. It reminds us how power, unbound and worshipped, eats away at the soul until only shadows remain, And it reminds us that history is not made by gods or emperors. It is made by the broken, the voiceless, the forgotten boys like Sporus, whose name survives not because of glory, but because of pain. When Sporus drank the poison, he was not merely escaping horror. He was reclaiming the only power that had ever been his, the power to choose his own end. What is more horrifying than death? For Sporus, it was resurrection, but not his own. To the Romans, identity was inseparable from dignity. A citizen was not just a man. He was a name, a voice, a role in society. But Sporus was denied even that. Once Nero saw Poppaea's ghost, in him the boy ceased to exist. His life, from that moment, belonged to the fantasy of another. Rome had always tolerated cruelty. It had spectacles of crucifixion, gladiatorial bloodbaths, and public executions. But what happened to Sporus was something more insidious, more chilling. It wasn't just physical domination. It was spiritual annexation. That he was not tortured as punishment. He was reprogrammed for pleasure, a mirror, made to smile back. The empire didn't just destroy Sporus's body. It rewrote his soul. No historical account ever quotes Sporus. No records survive that tell us what he thought, what he prayed for at night, or whether he even allowed himself the luxury of thought once his fate was sealed. What we know is second-hand observations of senators, sneers of historians, gossip of aristocrats. But woven between the lines is a clearer truth. Sporus was punished for being seen. Had he been ordinary, had his face not echoed Poppaea's beauty, he might have lived and died a low-ranking official. He might have grown old, forgotten by history. But beauty is dangerous, especially in the hands of the powerful. Especially when you remind a madman of what he destroyed. It wasn't his resemblance that cursed him, it was Nero's need to believe. It meant something. One might ask, why didn't anyone stop Nero? Where were the philosophers, the senators, the generals, the priests? They were there. They saw. They heard. They obeyed, because the deeper truth of Rome was this: power silences. Conscience. To question the emperor was treason. To doubt his grief was blasphemy. And to pity Sporus was to admit that Rome, mighty, disciplined, glorious Rome, had become a stage for perversions too monstrous to speak aloud. So they played their parts. They smiled. They bowed. They toasted the bride in his silks and jewels and powdered cheeks. They watched as his voice trembled through rehearsed feminine phrases. They cheered as the imperial couple entered the theater hand in hand. And when Sporus's eyes flickered, not with joy, but with unbearable exhaustion, none of them said a word. They couldn't, because by then, they too were actors in Nero's illusion. Perhaps the most disturbing element of Sporus's life was not his castration or his public humiliation. It was how completely he learned to perform. Ancient sources note this with fascination. How flawlessly he adopted the habits of a Roman noblewoman. How he remembered Poppaea's favorite phrases, her way of tilting her head, her refined laughter. How he played the part so well that even seasoned aristocrats occasionally caught themselves forgetting who he really was. This wasn't because he wanted to. It was because he had to. Imagine the weight of that performance. To wake up every day in a palace of lies, to dress in the garments of the dead, to smile at the man who destroyed your future, and to do it perfectly, because even the slightest misstep might bring death. Sporus became the most skilled performer in all of Rome. But it was a performance that devoured him. We might be tempted to cast Nero as the sole villain in this tragedy. Sporus did not suffer alone at his hands. He suffered beneath the gaze of an entire empire that watched and chose not to intervene. They watched when he was paraded in the Forum. They watched when he was married under torchlight. They watched when he accompanied Nero across Greece in silks and sorrow. And later, they watched again As Sporus was passed between emperors like a cursed relic, this was not just personal cruelty. It was a systemic failure of civilization that allowed one boy's identity to be erased for the sake of political theater. Rome, for all its law and philosophy, for all its architecture and literature, could not bring itself to protect a single life when power decided that life should be rewritten. And isn't that the ultimate horror? That Sporus didn't just lose his name. He lost the world's ability to see him as real. The final chapter of Sporus's life is almost too grotesque to believe. After Nero's death, he could have faded quietly into obscurity. But instead, he became a symbol, a tragic emblem of the mad emperor's reign, and a possession for those who wanted to claim Nero's power through association. Emperor Vitellius planned the ultimate degradation, forcing Sporus to perform in the Colosseum, reenacting the myth of Proserpina's rape, the goddess, dragged into the underworld against her. Well, it was not lost on anyone how cruelly appropriate this was. Who had already been dragged into a living hell was now expected to suffer again, this time on stage. For the entertainment of thousands. The metaphor would be brilliant if it weren't real. And so Sporus made the only decision that was ever truly his. He chose death. We often speak of suicide as defeat. But for Sporus, it was something else. It was the first moment of real autonomy in years. It was the first time he refused to be reshaped. In choosing death, Sporus said no, not just to Vitellius, not just to Rome, but to the entire machinery of identity theft that had defined his life. He was no longer Nero's Empress. No longer a doll. No longer a symbol. He was finally his own. And then he was gone. When historians write of Rome, they write of emperors, of wars, of conquests. They name cities and battalions and dynasties. But they often forget people like Sporus. Boys who never got to grow old. Women whose names were stripped away. Slaves who were told their bodies were not their own. Victims of spectacle, erased for the sake of power. Sporus is not a footnote. He is the thesis. His life shows us what power can do when it is unchecked, when it is fed by grief, delusion, and vanity. It reminds us that cruelty is not always loud. Sometimes it is soft-spoken, lavish, beautiful even. And that is when it is most dangerous. Sporus left no children, no heirs, no writings. But he left behind a legacy etched in silence. Modern scholars revisit his story with reverence. Queer historians see in him a symbol of gender trauma and bodily autonomy. Psychologists read his life as a case study in coercive control. Ethicists study him to understand what happens when performance becomes survival. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: you do not need to rule an empire to destroy a life. Sometimes all it takes is to look at someone and decide, you will be who I say you are. History does not forget so much as it chooses what to remember. Nero is remembered for fire, for cruelty, for vanity. Rome is remembered for glory, for conquest, for civilization. But Sporus? He walks between the margins, a ghost in the footnotes, a whisper in the archives. And yet, somehow, we remember him. Not because the empire wanted us to, but because even in silence, his story speaks volumes. There are no statues of Sporus. No letters he wrote. No speeches recorded. No tomb we can find. But if you stand in any ancient Roman ruin, beneath faded frescoes and crumbling marble, if you let the wind pass through the broken archways, you might hear it. I was here, and I mattered. Who owns a body? This is the question at the core of Sporus's story. Was his body his own? Or the emperor's? Was his identity something he could protect, or was it a costume, a set of gestures, a lie enforced by power? His castration wasn't just a physical mutilation. It was an erasure of future, of choice, of self. The empire took from him what it didn't even understand, the right to be something unscripted. And that question, who owns the body, remains just as relevant today. Every time a young person is told who they're allowed to love. Every time a survivor of abuse is asked why they didn't fight harder. Every time a child is forced to perform for the comfort of others. Sporus stares back from the mirror. He's still here. What kept Sporus alive for years wasn't luck. It was performance. His survival strategy, mastering the illusion. Playing the part was not weakness. It was brilliance. Resilience. He learned, faster than anyone, that the only way to remain breathing in Nero's Rome was to become a reflection. A flawless, silent mirror. But what happens to a person when their truth is never allowed to surface? When their real voice is never heard? They disappear, which is why telling this story matters. Not to speak of Sporus now, centuries later, is to do what Rome never did, to acknowledge him not as a doll, or a wife, or a curiosity, but as a person. In his final act, choosing death over degradation, Sporus didn't just escape. He reclaimed something. He refused to be rewritten again. It's easy to think of him only as a victim, but that's not the full truth. The fact that we remember him at all without inscriptions, without monuments, is a testament to the unshakable humanity that endured beneath the surface of his forced performance. He reminds us that even in the most controlled, most violated, most disfigured lives, there is something within that resists, that watches, that waits, that survives long enough to be remembered. 2,000 years have passed, but the ghost of Sporus still haunts us. Every time a person is forced to fit a mold they didn't choose. Every time identity is denied in favor of public comfort. Every time power decides what a body is worth. Sporus is not ancient. He is now. He lives in the trance, child facing rejection. In the refugee, used as a political pawn. In the girl in a glittering dress, who never got to speak. In the quiet survivors who carry their pain in silence. And just like him, they deserve to be seen. We don't know what name Sporus was born with. Sporus was likely a cruel nickname. It means seed in Greek, a mocking reminder of what had been taken from him. But perhaps that's the final cruelty we can undo. Perhaps we can say, your name was not seed. Your name was survivor. Your name was resistance. Your name was truth hidden beneath silks and powders, masks and performance. And now, across centuries, your story is finally being told. The life of Sporus teaches us that the worst atrocities are not always committed on battlefields. Some happen in palaces, behind closed doors, in whispered commands, beneath the weight of expectations, under the gaze of those who choose to look away. But his story also reminds us that even when the world strips you bare, renames you, and recasts you, there is still a piece of you they cannot touch. And if that piece survives long enough, even just long enough to be remembered, then you win. Sporus did not survive Rome, but he survives us. We remember. We bear witness. We speak his name. Not all stories are triumphant, but all lives are sacred. In memory of Sporus and all the silenced.